this is going to be similar to the counter that we have created earlier in the JavaScript chapter. So we are going to start the countdown. And this is going to be done by using multiple statements. So it is going to be better to use a function for this so that we can keep our code well structured. So our function is going to be called start countdown. Okay, so we're going to call the function here, but we're going to define our function at the end of the code. So the syntax is function followed by the name of our function, which is start countdown. And then inside curly brackets, we are going to place all the code that we execute for this function. So every second, we want to reduce this number by 1. And if you remember how we created our counter earlier, we have used the function setInterval. And to use that function, we used a variable where we stored the output of that function. So we're going to use a variable action, okay, that we are going to define at the beginning of our code. And we are going to store inside this variable the output of the function setInterval. Okay, if you remember, this function is going to take a couple of parameters. The first parameter is going to be a function. So we're going to define our function here. And the second parameter is going to be the duration in milliseconds. So in our case, we want to execute the code every second. So that's going to be every 1000 milliseconds. Okay. So now let's write code inside the function. So we want our remaining time to decrease by 1 every second. At the moment, we don't have any variable related to this number. Okay. So as we did for the score, we are going to create a variable which is going to be linked to this number here. Okay. So our variable is going to be called time remaining. Okay. So what's going to happen inside this function is that we're going to reduce the variable time remaining by 1. Okay. And the syntax is going to be minus =1, which means that we are reducing or decreasing this variable by something that is equal to 1. Okay. But at the moment, this variable doesn't have any initial value. Okay. So we need to have an initial value for our variable so that we can decrease it by 1. And the initial value is going to be set when we start our game. So what we're going to do, we're going to go back to the step where we showed our countdown box. Okay. And we are going to set our variable time remaining to 60. Okay. Because when we start the game, we start at 60 seconds. And also, we are going to change this element, okay, to 60. So we're going to access the inner HTML of this element here and change it to 60. So if we go to our index.html file, we'll see that this element is this span, which has got an ID time remaining value. Okay, so we're going to access this element using its ID. Okay, document gets elements by ID, and we're going to use the ID. And we are going to access the inner HTML and change that to time remaining. Okay. And we will do the same thing after we have updated the variable inside the function. Okay. So if we save this, okay, and start our game, now we can see that our counter is working. Okay. All right. Now, if we continue like this, we're gonna get to 0 seconds, and we are gonna keep going into negative numbers. and that's not what we want. Okay, so we are going to add a check inside the code to see if we have reached 0 or not. Okay, so if the time remaining is 0, so this means game over. Okay, so first of all, we are going to stop the counter. Okay, so to stop the counter, if you remember, we need to use the function clear interval. Okay, just like this, clear interval, and the parameter is going to be the same variable that we used with the set interval function. Okay, we can take this and place it in a function. Okay, so that our code is readable. So we're going to call this function stop countdown. Okay, so we're going to call it here, and we're going to define it at the end. Just like this, and we're going to paste this line. Okay, so now if we save and refresh our page, then this time the counter is going to continue until 0 seconds. Okay, all right, so once we stop the counter, we will need to show the game over message. Okay, and to do that, first of all, we need to make this div visible, okay, by changing the display property to block. And also, we are going to write this text inside the div. Okay, so first of all, let's make this div visible. So if we go to our index.html file, this div has got an ID game over. Okay, so to make it visible, we are going to use the display property. Okay, style display, and we're going to change that to block. All right, also we are going to change the inner HTML of this element. Okay, to a couple of paragraphs. So the first paragraph is going to be game over. So we shouldn't worry about the uppercase, because in our CSS styling we set the text transform property for game over to uppercase. So anything we write there is going to be transformed to uppercase. So the next paragraph is going to be your score is whatever the score is. Okay, so if we write for now your score is 0, what we need to do is change this number here to the value of our score. So to do that, I'm going to delete this, then cut the string to 2 halves, and then use the plus operator to add our score variable there. Okay, so one extra detail: once the game is over, we want the time box to disappear as well. So to do that, we are going to access this element using its ID, which is time remaining. And then we are going to use the display property that we are going to set to none. Okay. Also, just in case our correct box or try again box is there, we want them to disappear as well at the same time the game over box appears. So again, we're going to use the display property, but you would have noticed that by now we have used this display property many times using more or less the same statements. So it would be a wise idea to create a function or a couple of functions, one function to hide an element and another one to show an element. Okay, so we're going to create a couple of functions. First one is going to be called hide, and it's going to take a parameter ID, which refers to the ID of the elements we want to hide, and we are going to make this element disappear using the display property. So we're going to access the ID of the element using the given parameter, and we'll set the style.display to none. And the next function is going to be called show. Also, it's going to take as a parameter the ID of the element to show, and we're going to set the display property to block. So if we go back to all the statements where we used this similar statement, so this one, for example, is going to be changed to hide the element of ID time remaining. Okay, this one is going to be show the element of ID game over, and this one is going to be changed to show the element of ID time remaining. And let's add to our start countdown function. So after hiding the time remaining box, we want also to hide the correct and the try again box. So we're going to use the function hide. First one is the element of ID correct, and then the other one is the element of ID wrong. Okay. And finally, once we have done all this, we need now to change our mode to non-playing mode. So we're going to set the playing variable to false. Okay. Now we have finished our start countdown function. So before going back to our initial code and adding the final step, which is to generate a new question and multiple answers, let's just add a few comments to our code. So this section is going to be for functions, and the first one is start counter. The second one is stop the counter, and then this function hides a certain element, and the final one is used to show a certain element. So our last step inside our initial code, when we click on the start button and we start our game, is going to be to generate a question and multiple answers. A new question and multiple answers. All right. Again, we're going to be using multiple statements, and it would be a good idea to use a function for this. So we're going to call our function generate question and answer. So we're going to call it here, but we're going to define our function at the end in the functions section. So our function is called generate QA, again curly brackets, And let's write our code inside the function. Just before we continue, let's just try our game and make sure that everything we have done so far is working. So if we click on the Start Game button, first of all, text changed to Reset Game. The time box appears and the countdown is going, and our score is set to 0. Now I'm going to pause my video and wait until this is close to 0 seconds. Now we are almost there, and now it's 0 seconds, and we can see our game over div appearing there, and we can see your score is 0 because the score didn't change. But our Start Reset button didn't change to Start Game, and we are supposed to read Start Game here. The reason why is because we haven't done that yet. So once it's game over and our playing mode changed to false, we need to change the inner HTML of our Start Reset button to Start Game. So let's do that. So we're going to access the elements using its ID, which is Start Reset, and change the inner HTML to Start Game. And now if we save and start our game again, I'm going to pause until it's close to 0. Almost there. And now it's 0 seconds, and we can see our game over message appearing, and the text this time changed to Start Game. Alright, now let's try to initiate our game and see what happens. So if we click on the Start Game button, we can see that the counter appears and we can see the countdown going, but our game over message is still there. And the reason why is because when we initiated our game, we have shown the time remaining box, but we didn't hide the game over message. So let's do that. So we're going to go back to the piece of code where we initiated the game, and it was here. So when we clicked on the button, if we were playing, we reloaded the page, and if we were not playing, then we changed the mode to playing equal true. We set the score to 0, and we showed the countdown box, and we set the value of the time remaining to 60. After this, we are going to hide the game over box. And to do that, we're going to use the function hide, and we're going to use the ID of the game over box, which is game over. Right, now let's save and try again. I'm going to pause again. Now the game is over. Okay, let's start the game again, and this time our game over message disappears. Okay, now let's go to our generate QA function and start writing code there. So